August 17, 1943. The message reached Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters at 10:47 a.m. American forces had entered Messina. Patton had won the race. The prize Montgomery had spent 5 weeks fighting toward. The objective, he'd told Churchill, would showcase British military supremacy, had fallen to the Americans hours before British forces arrived. Montgomery's aide watched his commander's face carefully. The field marshal who'd defeated Rommel at El Alamein, who'd chased the Afrika Korps across North Africa, who'd been promised Sicily would be his triumph, stood silently, staring at the map showing American positions in Messina. Then he spoke, and what he said revealed everything about British pride, American ambition, and the moment the military balance of the Anglo-American alliance shifted forever. It was a jolly good race, Brigadier J.C. Curry would say hours later, shaking Patton's hand in Messina City Square after arriving with his British 4th Armored Brigade. But those gracious words masked fury, humiliation, and the uncomfortable realization that the Americans were no longer junior partners learning from British professionals. They were competitors who'd just beaten Britain at its own game. This is the story of what British commanders really said when Patton won the race to Messina: the public congratulations and private rage, the diplomatic courtesy and seething resentment, the moment Britain realized American military capability had exceeded British expectations and threatened British prestige. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky began with the largest amphibious assault in history to that date. Over 160,000 Allied troops stormed Sicily's beaches, supported by 3,000 ships and 4,000 aircraft. The strategic plan was clear. Montgomery's British 8th Army would drive up Sicily's eastern coast to capture Messina. Patton's American 7th Army would protect Montgomery's left flank and clear western Sicily. For Montgomery, this was perfect. His forces had the lead role, the direct route to the prize, the opportunity to demonstrate British operational excellence. The Americans would play a supporting part, important but secondary. Montgomery had even convinced General Harold Alexander, the British officer commanding all ground forces, to give 8th Army priority for roads, supplies, and operational freedom. In Montgomery's mind, Sicily would follow the pattern established in North Africa. British forces would deliver the decisive victories. American forces would provide necessary support. Churchill would celebrate British military leadership. The Empire's prestige would be maintained. What Montgomery never anticipated was that George S. Patton refused to accept that script. The first 2 days went according to Montgomery's plan. His 8th Army advanced rapidly up the eastern coast, capturing Syracuse on July 12th. Meanwhile, Patton's forces secured their beachheads at Gela and Licata, fought off German counterattacks, and began moving inland. Everything looked orderly, coordinated, appropriately British-led. Then on July 13th, Montgomery's advance stalled. German forces under Field Marshal Kesselring had established defensive positions in the mountainous terrain around Mount Etna and along the Catania Plain. Every mile became a battle. British casualties mounted. Progress slowed to a crawl. Montgomery's response was characteristically aggressive. He demanded more resources, better roads, American support to give him maneuver room. On July 13th, Alexander transferred control of Highway 124, the main east-west road through central Sicily, from American to British forces. This decision forced Patton's the Second Corps under General Omar Bradley to shift westward, away from any route to Messina. The Americans were being pushed aside to accommodate British operational needs. Patton's reaction, recorded in his diary that evening, was bitter. They gave us the future plan of operations, which cuts us off from any possibility of taking Messina. Monty's trying to steal the show. But Patton didn't just complain. He acted. On July 17th, Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters in Tunisia. He made his case directly. American forces could clear western Sicily quickly, then drive north and east along the coast to Messina. This would split Axis forces, prevent German reinforcement of the eastern sector, and possibly reach Messina before Montgomery. Alexander, caught off guard and perhaps tired of Montgomery's constant demands, agreed. He authorized Patton to advance on Palermo, then turn east toward Messina, provided he maintained positions supporting 8th Army operations. Patton left that meeting with authorization he fully intended to exceed. He'd created a provisional corps under General Jeffrey Keyes, comprising the 2nd Armored Division, 3rd Infantry Division, and 82nd Airborne Division. Over 45,000 troops were already moving northwest before Alexander's formal approval arrived. The race was on, though Montgomery didn't know it yet. July 22nd. Palermo fell to American forces after a lightning 100-mile advance through Sicily's interior. Patton entered the city in triumph, accepting the surrender of over 50,000 Italian troops. American newsreels captured the moment, cheering crowds, jubilant soldiers, Patton in full glory. When Montgomery learned of Palermo's capture, his initial reaction was dismissive. Palermo was in western Sicily, away from the main German defensive positions. It was a publicity stunt, not a strategic victory. The real prize remained Messina, and 8th Army would capture it. But Montgomery's staff officers noticed something he initially missed. Patton hadn't stopped at Palermo. He'd immediately turned his forces east, driving along Sicily's northern coast directly toward Messina. The Americans weren't supporting British operations anymore. They were competing with them. On July 25th, Montgomery and Patton met at Syracuse Airfield for what would become one of their most significant conversations. Montgomery, seeing that his own advance remained stalled around Catania and Mount Etna, made a surprising offer. According to Montgomery's diary, he suggested that 7th Army should drive hard toward Messina, using both Highway 113 along the northern coast and Highway 120 through the interior. 8th Army would take a back seat, allowing Americans to reach Messina first. Patton was immediately suspicious. Why would Montgomery, who'd fought for every advantage, suddenly offer to let Americans take the prize? The answer became clear. Montgomery wanted to preserve his forces for the upcoming invasion of mainland Italy. He'd rather let Americans suffer the casualties fighting to Messina than expend more British lives on an objective that was no longer as strategically important now that Palermo had fallen. But Montgomery had miscalculated. By offering Messina to the Americans, he turned what had been a coordinated operation into an acknowledged race, and Patton intended to win it. Patton's response, recorded in his diary that evening, showed his suspicions. I felt something was wrong, but have not found it yet. He'd accepted Montgomery's offer, but didn't trust the British commander's motivations. The following week saw both armies driving toward Messina through brutal terrain and determined German resistance. But the operational approaches were fundamentally different. Montgomery's 8th Army advanced methodically. British and Canadian forces fought carefully through the Etna line, taking positions systematically, minimizing casualties. It was professional, disciplined, the British way of war, learned through years of combat. Patton's 7th Army charged forward with aggressive speed. American forces fought through the rugged coastal terrain, conducted amphibious end runs to outflank German positions, pushed through exhaustion and casualties to maintain momentum. It was costly, sometimes recklessly so, but effective. The contrast wasn't lost on British commanders watching the American advance. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding a British corps, noted in his diary, "The Americans fight with extraordinary aggressiveness. They take casualties we would avoid, but they keep moving forward. Patton drives them hard, perhaps too hard, but he gets results." By early August, it was clear the Americans would reach Messina first. British forces were still fighting through German positions south of the city. American forces were approaching from the west, having bypassed or overwhelmed German defensive lines through sheer aggressive momentum. British commanders' private reactions ranged from grudging respect to outright resentment. Brigadier General Jumbo Wilson remarked to his staff, "Patton's conducting warfare like it's a sporting event. But one must admit, he's winning his sport." Major General Guy Simons, commanding Canadian forces, was less charitable. "The Americans are racing while we're fighting. They've taken the easier route and are claiming credit for reaching the finish line first, as if that's what this campaign was about." But the most significant reaction came from Montgomery himself. As reports showed American forces closing on Messina while British forces remained miles away, Montgomery's mood grew increasingly dark. He'd spent weeks telling Churchill, Alexander, and anyone who would listen that 8th Army would capture Messina. Now he'd have to explain why American forces got there first. August 16th. American forward elements were on Messina's outskirts. British forces were still fighting their way north. Montgomery sent a message to Alexander. 8th Army will reach Messina tomorrow morning. Request coordination with American forces to ensure orderly entry into the city. It was a last attempt to salvage some shared credit, to avoid the humiliation of arriving second. But the message came too late. August 17th, 1943, 10 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Mad Jack. Churchill's British commandos fought their way through mined roads and demolished bridges in the early morning darkness, racing to reach Messina. They brought bagpipes to celebrate beating the Americans into the city. At 10:30 a.m., they arrived in Messina's city square to find American forces already there. Patton was waiting, wearing his finest uniform, ivory-handled pistols gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. The scene that followed has become legendary, though the 1970 film Patton got it completely wrong. Montgomery didn't arrive to find Patton smirking. Montgomery didn't come to Messina at all that day. He stayed at his headquarters, unable or unwilling to face the humiliation personally. Instead, Brigadier J.C. Curry arrived with his British 4th Armored Brigade. He climbed out of his Sherman tank, saw Patton waiting, and understood immediately what this moment meant. The Americans had won. Britain had lost. The power dynamic of the alliance had shifted. Curry walked forward, extended his hand, and delivered the words that would be quoted in every history book. It was a jolly good race. "I congratulate you," Patton later wrote in his diary. "I think the general was quite sore that we had got there first." That was an understatement. What British commanders said publicly and what they said privately about Patton's victory were two very different things. Publicly, British officers were gracious. Curry's congratulations were genuine in tone. Alexander sent an official message. The capture of Messina by Allied forces marks the successful conclusion of the Sicily campaign. Both British and American forces fought with distinction. Churchill, informed of Messina's fall, issued a statement celebrating Allied cooperation and shared victory in Sicily. But privately, British reactions ranged from grudging admiration to bitter resentment. Montgomery's personal diary entry for August 17th was terse and revealing. Messina captured. American forces arrived first. Campaign concluded successfully, though coordination could have been better. That word, coordination, carried volumes. Montgomery was suggesting that Patton had achieved victory by abandoning coordinated operations, by turning a joint campaign into a personal race. To Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Britain's chief of the Imperial General Staff, Montgomery was more candid. In a letter dated August 19th, he wrote, "The American capture of Messina was achieved through operational methods that prioritized speed over coordination. Patton essentially conducted an independent operation, disregarding joint planning. While this achieved the tactical objective of capturing the city, it allowed substantial German forces to evacuate to mainland Italy. A more coordinated approach might have trapped those forces." This was Montgomery's defense. Patton won the race, but lost the strategic objective. Over 100,000 German and Italian troops had successfully evacuated across the Strait of Messina between August 11th and 17th. Montgomery, argued that if Patton had coordinated properly, instead of racing for glory, more enemy forces could have been captured. There was truth to this criticism. The German evacuation from Sicily was remarkably successful, saving forces that would fight again in Italy. But it also conveniently overlooked that Montgomery's own stalled advance around Mount Etna had given Germans time to prepare their evacuation. Alexander's reaction was perhaps most revealing. As ground forces commander, he'd been caught between Montgomery's demands and Patton's ambitions throughout the campaign. His official report praised both armies equally. But in private conversations, recorded by his staff officers, Alexander acknowledged discomfort with how the campaign had unfolded. "Patton essentially forced my hand," Alexander told his chief of staff. "He created situations where I had to approve his plans or risk public confrontation. He manipulated the command structure to achieve his objectives. That's not how coalition warfare should function." But Alexander also admitted grudging respect. However one judges his methods, Patton delivered results. He moved his army 100 miles through difficult terrain in days, captured Palermo, then drove east to Messina while maintaining offensive operations. That's operationally impressive, regardless of the strategic debates. Field Marshal Brooke, receiving reports from Sicily, was characteristically blunt in his diary. "The Americans have much to learn about proper military operations. But one cannot deny Patton's aggressive spirit achieved the tactical objective. The question is whether achieving objectives through uncoordinated methods is worth the strategic cost of reduced Allied cooperation." The British press initially celebrated Sicily's capture as an Allied victory, emphasizing British contributions. But American newspapers made Patton the hero, featuring dramatic photos of his entrance into Messina. This media narrative frustrated British commanders who felt their forces had done the harder fighting. One British brigadier complained in a letter home, "We fought the Germans for 5 weeks through the most difficult terrain in Sicily. The Americans raced through the easier Western territory against Italian forces, then claimed victory. The press coverage makes it seem like they won Sicily single-handedly while we merely participated." This perception, that American forces had taken the easier route to grab the headlines, became a common British narrative. It allowed British commanders to rationalize American success without acknowledging that Patton had simply outperformed Montgomery operationally. But not all British commanders shared this dismissive view. Some recognized that Patton's Messina victory represented something more significant than just aggressive tactics or favorable circumstances. Lieutenant General Dempsey noted in his diary, "Patton's drive to Messina demonstrated American operational maturity. They coordinated multiple divisions across difficult terrain while maintaining aggressive tempo. This wasn't beginner's luck. This was professional military operations executed at high level. We British must acknowledge that American capability has exceeded our expectations." This was a crucial admission. American forces weren't just enthusiastic amateurs anymore. They were professional military organizations capable of complex operations. The immediate aftermath of Messina brought an unexpected development that further complicated British commanders' assessment of Patton and American forces: the slapping incidents. On August 3rd and August 10th, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat stress, calling them cowards. When news of these incidents reached Eisenhower, he reprimanded Patton but kept it quiet. British commanders learned of the incidents through intelligence channels. Montgomery's reaction was complex. On one hand, the incidents seemed to confirm British views of Patton as undisciplined and temperamentally unsuited for high command. On the other hand, they raised uncomfortable questions about whether American commanders would be held to the same standards as British officers. If a British general had done what Patton did, Montgomery told his staff, he'd be relieved immediately. The Americans seemed willing to tolerate behavior from their commanders that we would never accept. This reflects different military cultures. But Montgomery also recognized the incidents gave him leverage. Patton's vulnerability over the slapping controversy meant he couldn't capitalize on his Messina victory as completely as he otherwise might have. British commanders noted this with some satisfaction. Alexander's view was more pragmatic. Patton's actions were inexcusable, he told Eisenhower. But you must decide whether his operational value outweighs his disciplinary issues. That's a command decision I don't envy you making. The long-term impact of Patton's Messina victory on British commanders' attitudes was profound and lasting. Montgomery never publicly acknowledged that Patton had outperformed him in Sicily. In his memoirs, published years after the war, Montgomery barely mentioned the race to Messina. He emphasized Eighth Army's difficult fighting through the Etna line, the casualties suffered, the professionalism displayed, but glossed over the fact that American forces reached the objective first. This selective memory reflected Montgomery's inability to accept that he'd been beaten. For a commander who'd built his reputation on defeating Rommel, who'd been positioned as Britain's greatest general, losing to Patton, an American commander he considered theatrical and undisciplined, was too humiliating to fully acknowledge. But in private letters to other British commanders, Montgomery was more honest. Writing to General Wilson in 1944, he admitted, "Sicily taught me that American forces under aggressive commanders can achieve operational results that exceed our own in certain circumstances." Patton's drive to Messina was professionally executed, despite my reservations about his methods. We must adapt to the reality that Americans are no longer junior partners but competitors. This was perhaps Montgomery's most significant admission. The Americans had become competitors, not just allies. And in that competition, Britain had lost. British commanders' assessment of Patton personally evolved in interesting ways after Messina. They started the Sicily campaign viewing him as theatrical, undisciplined, more concerned with glory than military effectiveness. The Messina victory forced reassessment. "Patton is operationally brilliant," Dempsey wrote in a confidential assessment. "His methods are sometimes questionable. His personality is difficult. His need for recognition is excessive. But his ability to move forces quickly, maintain aggressive tempo, and achieve objectives is exceptional. We British must acknowledge this, even if we don't like it." Alexander's post-campaign report was more measured. General Patton demonstrated aggressive leadership and operational skill during the Sicily campaign. His capture of Palermo and subsequent drive to Messina achieved tactical objectives with remarkable speed. However, questions remain about whether his emphasis on rapid advance over careful coordination served overall strategic goals. The strategic debate about Messina, whether Patton's race helped or hurt the campaign, continued for decades. British historians generally argued that Patton's glory hunt allowed German forces to escape. American historians countered that Montgomery's methodical approach gave Germans time to organize their evacuation. The truth lies somewhere in between. Both commanders contributed to German forces successfully evacuating Sicily. Montgomery's stalled advance gave Germans time. Patton's focus on reaching Messina rather than blocking evacuation routes gave them opportunity. But the tactical reality remained undeniable. Patton reached Messina first. He won the race. And that victory changed how British commanders viewed American military capability forever. In later campaigns, British commanders adjusted their expectations and approaches when working with American forces. They no longer assumed British operational superiority. They no longer designed plans that positioned Americans in purely supporting roles. They recognized that American commanders like Patton could execute operations that rivaled or exceeded British performance. This shift was perhaps Messina's most important legacy. The race didn't just determine who entered a Sicilian city first. It determined the future balance of the Anglo-American military partnership. What British commanders said when Patton won the race to Messina revealed wounded pride, grudging respect, strategic rationalizations, and uncomfortable acknowledgement. They said congratulations publicly while privately questioning his methods. They praised Allied cooperation while resenting American success. They criticized his tactics while admiring his results. But most importantly, they recognized that American military capability had matured beyond British expectations. The students had become competitors. The junior partners had proven themselves equals. And British military primacy in the Western Alliance, already fading, had suffered another significant blow. Brigadier Currie's words in Messina's city square, "It was a jolly good race. I congratulate you," were gracious and sporting. But they also marked the end of an era when British commanders assumed they'd always reach the finish line first.